Hi there, I'm Brendan Burns, CVP for Azure Resource Manager and DevOps in Azure. Have you been wondering the best way to describe and deploy resources to the Azure cloud? Well, the modern cloud-native way to do development and deployment of Azure resources is Infrastructure as Code, or IAC. With Infrastructure as Code, you use a simple text format to describe your resources, and then you can take that description and use it to reliably and repeatedly deploy your application around the world. Now, traditionally, infrastructure as code languages have been a little complicated, hard to learn, and honestly, not that much fun. With Bicep, a new infrastructure as code language from Azure, we've put a real focus on designing a language that's easy to start with, fun to use, and has great tooling in familiar environments like VS Code. Whether you're a beginner in the world of infrastructure as code or you have a bunch of experience in ARM templates, we invite you to join us on Microsoft Learn Live. There, we're going to have a series of lessons with subject matter experts on the Bicep team, helping you understand the best way to use Bicep to do infrastructure as code on Azure. Along the way, you'll learn Bicep basics, get to know the tooling in VS Code, and even learn a lot about Azure resources along the way. We're inviting you to come and enjoy this free learning experience in a series of weekly lessons starting Tuesday, March 8th, 2022. We hope to see you there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Learn Live, learning all about Bicep. My name is Will the Leader. I'm a customer engineer working on the Fast Track for Azure team based in Auckland, New Zealand. And I'm joined today by Joshua Waddle. Josh, introduce yourself.
Hey, Will, how's it going? Good to see everybody again. My name is Josh Waddell. I am a senior customer engineer, also on the Fast Track for Azure team, but I'm with the Fast Track for Azure for ISVs and startups. Based here in Washington. So really good to see everybody today. You may notice on your screen that there is a QR code and a link. If you'd like to follow along with today's session on MS Learn, feel free to use a QR code, scan that there, or click the link, follow the link there. Joining us today is William Salazar. Everybody say hello to William. Hey, William, how's it going? William is joining us as our moderator today. So he's going to be fielding all of your questions on YouTube, Twitch, Learn Live, everywhere we're broadcasting today. So feel free to ask him some questions. And he's also going to be feeding us some questions here as well. So don't hesitate to reach out to Will.
Cool. So today we're going to be learning all about structuring our Bicep code for collaboration. When we write our Bicep code, as with most code languages, we do it in a collaborative environment. And today we're going to learn about how we can do that while following some best practices, how we can actually plan our templates to make them easy to deploy, but also easy to share as well by using a consistent style with a clear structure and some comments. So when others use our Bicep code, it's easy to understand, use, and modify if we need to. So our learning objectives today, Josh, are?
Yeah, learning objectives today. We are going to select the appropriate parameters for our Bicep file and how we would utilize parameters to identify resource names and other values. We're going to structure our Bicep code and parameters to support your team collaboration. So if you're thinking about doing different deployments for different types of environments and so forth, how we can structure that code to support that collaboration across teams. And then also we're going to go through talking about documenting your Bicep code by using comments and resource tags. So let's go ahead and get into the introduction. Will, why don't you lead us off on our scenario here?
Awesome. So one of the benefits of deploying your infrastructure as code is essentially that it's this idea that we template our infrastructure as code. And the reason we do this is to make it more shareable, so we can actually collaborate with other members on our team on our Bicep code. And a big part of this is it's really important to make sure that that Bicep code that we share is easy to read and easy to work with. We don't want to make life difficult for our other team members by just basically writing this beautiful mess of a Bicep template and then just handing it over to someone else, and they look at it and they're like, what is this? The idea is we need to make it shareable, we need to make it understandable and easy for other people in our team to work with our Bicep code. And in this module and today's lesson, we're actually going to learn some ways how we're going to structure that and style our Bicep code so it's easy for others to understand. So if we take our example scenario, scenario that we've been working with throughout this series, suppose we're an Azure infrastructure administrator working at a toy company. And our team, we've been working on standardizing our infrastructure deployments using Bicep, and we've built a library of reusable templates. And out of the blue, 2 members of the quality control team
That never happens that way, does it?
This never happens. This is a totally hypothetical scenario. We're just using it as an example. They come to us and say, we need to run a customer survey. And to accomplish this, we need to deploy a new website and a database. And this needs to be deployed yesterday. They're on a tight deadline, and they need to accomplish this without actually starting from scratch and building an entire new template because they don't want to and they don't have to. So after speaking to them about their requirements, we already have a template that they can use or that's close to what they need. So we have a template that they can use, but we're worried that it might not be ready for them to use. So the question that we're going to ask ourselves today is, how can we revise that template to ensure that it's correct, that it's easy to understand and easy to read and easy to modify if the quality control team need to?
Awesome. All right, so in this module, what we're focusing on here, this again directly maps to the Learn module on MS Learn. We're going to learn how to improve and refactor Bicep files to make your code easier for others to work with. How parameters and names are an important part of making your Bicep code and deployments useful to others, and how to define our structure. So if you think about the scenario that Will was kind of reviewing here, we want to make sure that the templates that we're building, the Bicep files that we're putting together, are easily usable across the organization, almost making them somewhat generic, right? Easy to understand names, easy to understand structure, easy to review, so that as the scenario dictates, we can pass that off to the other team, and they can do that same deployment with just making a couple of modifications. So that's what we're going to be focusing here in this particular module. So what is the main goal? The main goal here, by the end of this module, we'll be able to author Bicep templates that are clear, reusable, and well documented. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and kind of set the stage for all of the things that we're going to be talking about over the course of the next hour or so. And we're going to run through a quick little exercise. Will's going to share his screen. The first exercise is really just a kind of a review of an existing template. We're going to look at something that already exists. We're going to try to maybe identify a couple of things that we can modify. So Will, why don't you go ahead and pull up VS Code and show us what this template looks like?
Cool. So got my VS Code up and running. Is it ready to share, Monique?
Looks like we're there.
Oh, awesome.
Yep.
Sweet. So starting right off, I just have this parameter of location of a string type. And it's just a resource, just using the location of the resource group. And then I've got this kind of parameter for SKU name. Josh, what are you thinking when you see this? I've got all the allowed SKUs that I can have. Is that pretty straightforward, or do we think we can improve that a little bit?
Yeah, not necessarily, right? Because there's quite a few different resources in Azure that take advantage of a SKU name value, right? We could be talking about virtual machine sizes. I think this is an app service plan size based on some of the values that are in there. But we might want to get a little bit more descriptive with that name. What type of SKU is this truly defining? We've got quite a few options there. So we might look at maybe cleaning up some of the options that exist there, maybe making some determinations, whether we're talking about different environments and so forth.
We're also hard coding a value as well, which seems unusual that we're allowing all of these potential SKUs and then just hard coding the value at the end anyway. Let's scroll down a little bit. So I've got a min value decorator here for my SKU capacity. Again, what that capacity relates to in terms of the product that we're actually using or applying that SKU to, that could be a little bit more descriptive, I feel. I've got this parameter for SQL administrator login and also login password as well. I've only got the secure on one of them, where perhaps we want to put the secure on the login as well. And what is that login related to? Is that the username? Is that the password? It would help if those two were a little bit more descriptive.
Yeah, and maybe even, some kind of separation, between lines 20 and 21 there. Like it almost makes it look like that those two parameters are meant to be together. We might want some separation in there, kind of like a little bit more clarity, so somebody doesn't kind of skip over that as they're reviewing the file.
Yeah. Coming down a little bit more, so we've got some more parameters. So we've got one for managed identity name string. If I was brand new to manage identities, I might look at that and think, well, what does that actually mean? I've also got a role definition ID, which is just a GUID value here. Azure has like a rich resources of RBAC controls, so it might be a little bit helpful to explain what that role actually is, what that role definition ID, what that actually is. We've got a website name that's doing some kind of like string interpolation here. What do you think of that? I mean, obviously we could space these out a little bit, but what's kind of screaming out on the code there?
Yeah. I mean, spacing them out, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Talking about some descriptions on some of this. If you're new to this, if you're that team that's been handed that template, to deploy this new particular site, what role definition is that? Can we, give some explanation about what that actual ID is? Some spacing, the unique string piece, right? Maybe some clarity as well there around the unique string function. We're actually going to talk about unique string a little bit later. But maybe some clarity here in a description or a comment that discusses what that's actually going to be.
Cool. And then this parameter just screaming out to me. Container one name. Like what does that container mean? Is it a storage container? Is it a container instance? Like what does that actually mean?
Agreed.
So we've got some variables here as well. We kind of talked about the unique string already. Let's go into the resources. So
back up just a second. Something else there in the variables. We're defining some names as parameters, but then we're also defining some names as variables. Maybe some clarity around as to why we might do that, right? Are the variables actually referencing the parameters with their string interpolation, or are they kind of being constructed the same way, right? And I think later when we talk a little bit about naming conventions and resource names, that might add a little bit, of clarity of what we could do here for dividing up between parameters and variables.
Agreed. All right, going into the resources. What I can see right away, I've got a little yellow squiggly line underneath location. Let's have a look at that. So a resource location should not use a hard-coded string or variable value. Please use a parameter value, an expression, or the string global. Yeah, so this hard coding of the location right away, Bicep is already not complaining about it, but it's just giving us a little warning that, hey, this is not good. This is not best practice. You might want to put this as a parameter. Thinking back to the top of our file, we're actually defining the location here of the resource group. That's using the location of the resource group. Why are we not using that here as well? Why are we not taking advantage of that?
Yeah, the other thing it notes in there in that error message, if you hover over that, right, unless you're using the string global, right, and so certain Azure resources, most Azure resources, I should say, do belong or are tied to a specific region, in terms of the deployment. But there are resources out there, DNS zones, front door instances that don't necessarily land in a specific region. They are a global resource. So the only kind of acceptable string value in that location field would be the word global, right? We'd mostly be using that, like you showed the location parameter up top based on the resource group name.
Yeah. And then we've got a child resource here for blob services. And it's using existing blob services. So, Josh, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I want to kind of take a look at that and how we want to define a parent resource, parent and child resource. How are we constructing child resources within our file? We'll talk about that a little bit later in this module briefly, but there was actually a session, I believe it was last week, where it was a full Learn Live session that actually got into how we define parent and child resources. So clearly there's some, the blob services is written within the resource definition of the storage account, while container 1 actually below is being written kind of outside, the structure of that storage account. So we probably want to clean some of that up and be a little bit more consistent.
Yeah, and that symbolic name as well, container 1, is a little bit ambiguous as well. Is it the only container in our storage account? Are there several containers? What purpose does that container serve? That could be a little bit more descriptive.
Yep,
here,
absolutely.
I think. Coming down to our SQL Server resource. So we've got our SQL Server name, we've got a location, we've got the administrator login and password. Again, that username is not quite as descriptive, but potentially could add that in there. And we've also got a version. Any thoughts on that, Josh?
That one, to me, just on first look, looks pretty good for that section. Taking advantage of parameters well with SQL Server name and the location and both the login and the password. Maybe no, I really don't even think so. Anything changing on the version, so that section looks good. You have any thoughts there?
No, I pretty much agree with you. Yeah, so it's good to, when we're reviewing code, to not just point out the bad, but also point out the good as well. And then we've got this variable name here. I'm not a big fan of this. I'm a big fan of kind of grouping, not resources, but grouping sections together, so variables together, parameters together. Josh, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but what do you think?
Yeah, it really is kind of a personal preference as to how you structure your files, and that would probably be a team collaboration decision as well. I generally fall under the thought process of putting all my parameters together, putting my variables together, and then resources defined after that. Although, I have seen some situations when you're building kind of like a main Bicep file where you want to kind of define some variables right before a module. Like I've seen some instance of that as an acceptable way. Both are acceptable ways, we should say. But we are going to talk about this a little bit later about the different options and ways that you can structure this. But me personally, I would probably be moving line 67 up with the other variables.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Looking at that symbolic name, we've got a database name, like underscore database name after SQL Server name. What are your thoughts on that, Josh?
So that to me looks like that maybe this particular section of the file was exported from the Azure portal. We're going to have a session actually 2 weeks from now on kind of migrating your files from JSON over to Bicep. And utilizing that export function out, from the portal. You may be familiar with it. You can go into a resource or a resource group and click export template. It looks like this resource was exported from the JSON in the portal. And some of the symbolic names and parameter names that get exported really need to be kind of cleaned up a little bit when you talk about refactoring. So that's what it kind of looks like to me.
Cool. And then the SKU name is also hard-coded here. So we're just defining basic as well, where perhaps we could stick that into a variable and we could explicitly say, hey, this is the SQL Server SKU name, rather than putting the basic there. We could even have that as a parameter if we're deploying a SQL Server across different environments.
Yeah, the other thing I would think about, though, is like, well, what if we want to give options for the SKU? Based on the type of environment that's being created, right? Are we doing something for the prod environment? Are we doing something for a dev environment? Maybe we want to use a higher core count, on a production environment versus a dev test environment. So maybe some logic to help make that decision based on the type of environment being built.
Yeah, definitely. Anything else about this this resource you want to comment on?
The name construction, we may want to kind of revisit that, and kind of talk about, that parent-child relationship again, right? Because the SQL Server database is actually essentially a child of the SQL Server. So we may want to restructure that a little bit as well. Yeah.
Cool. Coming down to our IP addresses that we allow on the SQL Server itself. Any thoughts on this? We've got this, again, it looks like it's been exported from the portal.
Yep.
We've also got this depends on here, and it's giving me a bit of a squiggly line complaining. So remove unnecessary depends on entry SQL Server. What are your thoughts on that, Josh?
Yeah, so if you've spent time, with JSON templates, we know that writing an old JSON ARM template that we had to explicitly define, dependencies, right? So in this particular case, this resource or this child resource really can't be deployed until the SQL Server exists, right? This is a child of the SQL Server. And in JSON, we had to use the depends on declaration. We're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, to explicitly state the order in which resources get deployed. With Bicep, as we've learned over the course of the last 7 weeks, that dependencies are defined for us, right? If we're referencing something in a parent-child relationship or referencing something from like a .id of a previous resource, then those dependencies are automatically calculated. So the tooling here is telling us that we don't need to define this. And so that's a couple of extra lines of code that we could remove.
Cool. What do you think about the IP addresses, both start and end IP addresses?
Well, this does tend to be kind of like a very generic firewall rule for the SQL Server, right? This is kind of the default one that we see on most templates that are created. You may want to consider pulling those out as possible parameters, because obviously it may be different depending on where the deployment is happening, what prod, dev, test, or perhaps it's a different region and we're locking access to it. So you may want to strip those out and make those parameters as well.
Cool. Let's go down to a product manual. So this looks like blob services. It looks like another container. Yeah. So this seems to be out of place. We had our storage account further up our Bicep template, and now we're just defining it here as well, or defining a container here as well. I'd be more inclined to kind of group those resources together, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm also using some string interpolation here as well. So storage account name, and then the product manual's name for the container name as well. So it could be better, instead of doing all this, to actually define the parent as well. And it's not an existing resource, so it might be missing some information here as well. Coming down to the app service plan. So we've got our hosting plan name. Also got the location that we defined earlier previously in our template, and also the SKU name and SKU capacity. So so it references that those two parameters that we defined earlier are referenced to this app service plan. So maybe we can make some improvements on these parameter names to just make that a little bit more explicit.
Yeah, no, totally agree with that. Like app service plan SKU name, app service plan SKU capacity. Try to clearly define that parameter, because SKU could have applied to, if you were to scroll back up and look at the storage account, we've got a SKU property on the storage account, right? So, clearly defining those parameters is definitely gonna make this a little bit easier to understand. Yeah.
So come back down, and could benefit from a little bit of white space as well.
Yes.
It's all bunched up together. That just makes it a little bit more readable and just, makes it look nicer, I think.
Agreed.
Coming down to our actual app service. So we've got our website name. We've got a location that we defined earlier. We're using the ID of our hosting plan to say, hey, deploy it to this app service plan. Here we go. So here's our managed identity. So we got MSI ID. Do you have any idea of what that might be, Josh?
Well, we did say that there was a parameter up above called managed identity. Wondering if so what that is there under the app service is that it's actually referencing a symbolic name of a resource in here defined as MSI. And I don't think we've run across MSI yet. So I don't know if there's a MSI defined a little bit further down. Obviously we haven't gotten to the bottom of the template, but it's referencing something that within the template doesn't look like it's been defined yet. Will, you mentioned kind of structuring things in a certain sequence and keeping things together. I kind of write my files in the way that I'm kind of like imagining the order in which they would be sequenced. So if I'm going to be referencing something like a managed service identity or a managed identity, I would probably define that resource a little bit higher in the template just to make that easier to understand. So if somebody's looking at this for the first time, they see msi.id, but that hasn't been defined. They've got to scroll even further into the template to find out where that's from.
Yeah, agreed. And then we've got this absolutely beautiful mess of commented out code. What do you think of that, Josh?
Well, it's obviously something that we don't need anymore. It's a connection string that's being identified, obviously connecting into SQL. It's using individual single line comments, right, on all of these lines. So we could consider doing kind of a comment block and saving ourselves a little bit of time there. But yeah, just the single line comments versus a comment block.
Or if we don't need it anymore, we could just remove it.
Yeah, absolutely. We do that too.
Yeah. And here's our managed identity. So here we go. So it's defined a little bit further down. Yeah, so we've got our managed identity name and the location as well. Yeah, so probably best to just kind of remove all of that commented out code, especially when we're working in source control and collaborating with others, right? We kind of want to leave tidy code behind and make code, we'll talk about this a little bit later, make our code self-documenting. So the more comments we add, the less readable our code can become. And we'll talk about how we can actually be very considerate when we comment our code. Yeah. And then we've got our role assignment as well. So this is the role assignment that we're assigning to our managed identity. This GUID function here, passing in the role definition and resource group ID, potentially could be explained a little bit more if I'm a member of the quality control team and I'm coming to this brand new and I just want to use this template. Maybe I want to just kind of get an understanding of what that actually means. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, it's when you're doing role assignments in Bicep in JSON, the syntax is a little difficult to understand. What you're taking a look at right there. So I think a really good comment and description section here is really going to make sure that whoever is reviewing this template is going to get a good understanding of what's happening. So as much detail as we can provide here would be beneficial.
Yeah. Anything else about this role assignment? I mean, I'm looking at this symbolic name and maybe that could be role assignment instead.
Yeah, go to camel case. Yeah. Maybe a little bit more clarity as to what the role assignment is. In the symbolic name. Nothing wrong with being as descriptive as possible. Also got some white space between 147 and 149, so we could clean that up. Yeah.
Cool. And then coming down to our final resource. So it looks like an App Insights instance.
Yep.
Again, it looks like it's been exported from the Azure portal. We've got this hard-coded name. That kind of bugs me a little bit.
Bugs me for a couple of reasons. one that we're like you mentioned, we're hard coding the name there, but we're not using a clear naming convention. And that's not necessarily a topic for Bicep or JSON, but just resource names, as a whole. A clear, concise, easy to understand, descriptive naming convention for your resources. And we'll reference that a little bit later in today's call, in today's discussion. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so we've reviewed our Bicep template. Should we look into ways on how we can actually clean this up?
Say that again?
Should we look into ways at how we can clean this up?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's kind of dive into each of these things. I think we've kind of introed, quite a few of the things that we're going to talk about here. So we're going to go through some conversation, talk about some of these individual pieces, and then we're going to jump back in. We're going to refactor this file. So, all right. So the first section here we're going to talk about is improving parameters and names. So yeah, if you could pull back up the slide presentation for us, that would be great. All right. So here, going through talking about improving parameters and names. I'm a big believer in clear, easy to understand parameter names, variable names, resource names, symbolic names, making things easy, clearly defined, so that no matter who looks at that template, they're going to get a good idea of what that particular resource is or what that particular definition is, right? So our colleagues are going to use this to interact with the template. They're going to make modifications to the values, right? If we're sharing these templates in a collaboration format. So again, we want to make sure that these names are very clear and understand, right? So when we talk about how understandable the parameters are, we want to talk about how they help make Bicep files reusable and flexible. We've mentioned that a couple of times here. Default values we can define within our parameter files, right? I believe we had some of that in the code there. You can specify what the default value is, but if nobody is submitting a particular value at the time of deployment, whether that's through a parameters file and so forth, it will fall back to that default value. Any thoughts on default values, Will?
It's super handy to get started. So if you've got a value that you know that's going to be consistent, default values are great. But it is a better balance of making your templates reusable and shareable, so allowing other people to provide values to those parameters, to making them just simple and straightforward, just to deploy right from the bat.
Yeah. So if we're providing a parameters file, which you learned about in the parameters session from a few weeks ago, that value defined in the parameter file is going to overwrite that default value. So it's an option there for that. So with how understandable are the parameters, we can do some things with parameter decorators to help us kind of clearly define our parameters. We can use descriptions on top of our parameters, and you'll see that in the code a little bit later. We can use @ description and then actually put in a value in quotes that can give us a human readable information about that particular parameter. We can implement value constraints. We can implement some value constraints, and there's a couple here that we have an option for. We can use what's called the allowed decorator, which we saw in the example there. These are the allowed values that can be defined on this particular parameter. We can also do min values and max values. We may have seen that in the example, but we definitely will take a look at that later in terms of, what's the minimum number of app service plan instances we want to support versus a maximum number. So if somebody does in a parameters file, let's say put 12 instances of an app service plan and we've got set at 5, then that deployment's gonna fail. Using minimum length and maximum length decorators, we can specify how long an actual value can be. And this is actually important when you think about storage accounts and other resources that have naming constraints on them. So for example, the storage account can have only 24 characters and has to be a globally unique name. So we can use minimum length and max length decorators to kind of enforce the length of that string. We can also put some metadata. Not commonly used, but we can add some additional metadata to our parameters as well. So I think I kind of covered this in the previous discussion, but we do need to be careful with the allowed values. Also be careful with our min and max length. In this case, they talk about how the allowed parameter decorator, we may get new SKUs, right? So if you do an allowed values for acceptable SKUs, and new SKUs might be introduced, and we'd have to go ahead and go back and rewrite that file to allow those new pieces in. Anything to add on decorators, Will?
Yeah, decorators can be helpful to kind of tell people what our parameters are doing. But like you said, with the allowed parameter, Azure is a moving target. So new SKUs are being introduced, old SKUs are being retired. So we just need to be careful about what we put in through that allowed parameter. So looking back to our template, we had quite a lot of SKUs there that it supported. Some of those SKUs, it would require us to, as those SKUs get retired, go back to that Bicep template and just try and revisit them and try and update that all the time. And that takes time because, we're not just updating the template, we're also committing it to source control. Then we're also making sure our deployments work, and we're doing some regression testing to make sure that we don't introduce any new behaviors. For example, we're deploying a free tier, and then all of a sudden by accident, we're paying for multiple VM sizes and all. Yeah, we just want to be very careful how we use that allow parameter, like you said.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk a little bit about flexibility. So, if we want to make these files a little bit more flexible, variations between environments, Will, talk to us a little bit about this here.
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, one of the goals for defining our infrastructure as code is to make our templates reusable and flexible. We don't want to create templates that serve a single purpose, that have hard-coded configuration, and basically that's what's defined in the template, that's what you get. But on the other hand, it doesn't make sense to expose all of our resource properties as parameters.
Yeah.
So The idea here is to create templates that work for our specific business requirements or solution, and not try and be generic for every single situation. You also don't want to have parameters that it takes a long time to enter all the values before the template can be deployed. And this is really important when we're actually configuring SKUs and instance counts of our resources. So when we're planning our template, you want to try and balance that flexibility with simplicity. And there are two common ways that we can actually provide parameters within a template. If we go to the next slide.
Yep.
So the two ways we can actually do that is we can provide a freeform configuration option or use a defined configuration set. And let's consider this in terms of an app service plan. So both our app service plan and our storage account require that we specify their SKU sizes. You might want to consider creating a set of parameters to control the SKUs and instance counts of those resources. So taking a look here, providing it as a freeform configuration option, this provides the most flexibility because anyone who uses the template can specify a combination of parameter values. However, as we add more resources, we'll need to add more parameters. So as a result, your template can become a little bit more complicated. Also, you might need to restrict certain combinations of parameters or ensure that when a specific resource is deployed using one SKU, another resource needs to be deployed using a different SKU. So if you provide too many specific parameters, it can be a little bit challenging to enforce those rules. So if we go to the next slide, think about the people who are going to use your template. Seeing dozens of parameters. If we go back to our quality control team, they just want to deploy something quickly. And if they see dozens of parameters all over the place, that's going to overwhelm them. And they might just look at your template and think, well, it's going to be easy to build something ourselves that makes that makes sense to us, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of it. So yeah, just think about how many parameters you're actually going to be using within your template and be considerate to those who are going to use it. Now, you might be able to reduce the number of parameters by grouping related parameters in the form of a parameter object like this. So here I've got a parameter object for app service plan SKU, defining the name and capacity. However, there's always a catch with these things. This approach might reduce your ability to actually validate the parameter values. And it's not always easy for template users to understand how to define the object. So there's a little bit of a balance that you need to strike here.
So real quick on that, how do I reference the capacity value in my app service plan in the resource definition? How am I going to reference the parameter and then more specifically the object within that parameter? What's the syntax look like there?
I think the syntax, you can go app service plan SKU.name. So as you define your app service plan resource, you can just reference that object to just use some dot notation to say, this is my app for the name of this app service plan SKU. Just use the app service plan SKU.name and then the app service plan .capacity for your capacity. We actually, when we refactor our Bicep template later, I'll show you how this works.
Awesome.
Cool. Alternatively to that, we can provide a configuration set. So essentially, this is a single parameter whose value is a restricted list of allowed values, such as environment types. So when users deploy our template, what they'll need to do is select a value for only this one parameter. And when they select the value for the parameter, the deployment will automatically inherit that set of configuration. And if we go to the next slide, this is what it kind of looks like. Cool. So this is what a predefined configuration set looks like. They offer lower flexibility because the people who deploy your template, they can't specify sizes for individual resources, which means we can't validate each configuration, and it's difficult to ensure that they fit all of our requirements. But using configuration sets reduces the needs for our templates users to understand all the different options available for each resource, which is easier to test and support and trouble set templates. So here it's just essentially a map variable that we define specific properties that we set on various resources based on a parameter value. And then your resource definitions will use this configuration map to define the resource properties.
And, hey, I don't think we have everything on the screen here for this particular configuration map, but what it's kind of showing me here is we've got 2 allowed values for our environment type, test and production. And then it looks like we've defined a production map down in that particular variable. I'm assuming that there's going to be a test one below that, and we can use some sort of conditional deployment, whereas if the environment is production or if the environment is test, then it'll apply the appropriate configuration map to the resource we build. Yeah. Awesome.
And this approach is sometimes called t-shirt sizing. So when I go to the store and buy a t-shirt, I don't get the options of, hey, I want it to be this long, this wide, with the sleeves and all the extra options I'd like to have when I'm buying my t-shirts. I simply have to choose from small, medium, or large. And the t-shirt designer will have those predefined measurements based on that side. And this is what you can liken configuration sets to, or predefined configuration sets to.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how your resources are named. And there's 2 names that we really talk about in here in this particular section. One is going to be on what we call symbolic names, and the other one is resource names. So I'm actually going to start with resource names. Resource names are the actual names of the resources of what you create in Azure. This is what you're going to see inside the portal. The name of the storage account, the name of the virtual machine, the name of the Azure function. Different resources have different constraints on their names. Certain ones have to be globally unique in terms of, within DNS. Some can only have a certain number of characters. We mentioned it before. Storage accounts can only have 24 characters in their name. So those are the resource names. And there's a lot of guidance out there, on what is the appropriate naming convention for resources. You can review this in the Cloud Adoption Framework on how we suggest that you name your resources. The other one that we talk about here is symbolic names. And this is something that was kind of introduced with Bicep. With a symbolic name, they kind of allow us to access the properties and the configuration of a resource. It helps us to calculate, resource IDs. If you're used to JSON templates and you needed to reference an ID of an existing resource, it was, //subscriptions /subscription ID /resource group name /resource provider, and type it all the way down to the end of the actual name to get the actual ID of a resource. But symbolic names give us the ability to access those properties and values of individual resources. And I think I might have jumped ahead a little bit. That's what we're talking about here on symbolic names. But this does allow us. So for example, what we see here in line 38, the symbolic name is app service plan. So if we need to reference that app service plan, like we saw in a previous demo, where the web app or the app service needs to use that particular app service plan, we can simply use the symbolic name appserviceplan.id to actually reference the resource ID of that app service plan. And again, using those symbolic names in that process does the automatic dependency calculation, within our file. So we don't have to do that depends on conversation. So jumping back into resource names, we did kind of talk about it a little bit before. I got a little bit ahead of the slides. My apologies there. But the one thing I do want to mention here is the unique string function. So we saw that in our demo a little bit before. We have the ability to use and generate a unique string as part of our name. And it's most frequently done based on the ID of the resource group. And we can use this as a suffix, a uniqueness suffix. This is very, very valuable when you think about app services and storage accounts or PaaS services that need to have globally unique names within Azure. We can use the unique string function to generate a suffix at the end of that name, and that suffix is based on the ID or the GUID of the resource group, kind of guaranteeing that your resources are going to have globally unique names. It may not look incredible inside the Azure portal, right? You're going to have this string of 9 to 12 additional characters at the end that really don't mean anything, but it does allow for that uniqueness to be created. Any thoughts there, Will?
Yeah, I kind of get you with the whole how it looks in Azure portal, but again, it does guarantee that unique namespace. And if you're clever about how you name your resources, like you said, we can actually say what the type of resource is, maybe at the end or at the start of the resource name, and then just when we're searching for it in Azure, we just type that in, and we should be able to find it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're not always guaranteed that the name you create for your app service or your storage account is going to be globally unique. So this takes that worry out of it there. Okay. So, and it talks about here for the resource names, it's better to use the uniqueness suffix as a suffix rather than a prefix, right? That's kind of a general best practice. And as you mentioned before, kind of lead with a nicely constructed name, app dash environment, dash region, and then put that uniqueness suffix at the end. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about planning the structure of your Bicep file. And Will, you kind of talked about, we kind of reviewed this a little bit in our example before. What are we kind of focusing on here?
Yeah, so when it comes to the structure of our Bicep code, now I have opinions, as we all do as programmers. But what's great about Bicep is it actually gives you the flexibility on how to decide how you're going to structure your code. And you can basically, our Bicep template will contain many elements. So in our template, we saw parameters, values, resources. I don't think we saw modules, but we can have modules. And obviously, some of those modules might have outputs. And we can also have a target scope for our entire template. And Bicep doesn't actually enforce an order for your elements to follow. However, and a big however, as we saw in that template, it is important to consider the order of your elements to ensure that our template is clear and understandable. And there are two ways that we can go about this. We can either group our elements by element type, or we can group elements by resources. And what's important here, no matter which way you use, I have a preference, so, pinch of salt. It's important that you and your team agree on one approach and use it consistently. So let's talk about grouping elements by element type. So essentially here, we group all our elements of the same type together. So all of our parameters would go one place, usually at the top of the file, and then come our variables, followed by our resources and then our modules, and then outputs are placed at the bottom. So taking this example here, we might have a Bicep file that deploys an Azure SQL database and a storage account. So we've got all of our parameters here, then we've got the variables, then we define our resources for our storage account and our SQL database, and then we have an output for our blob endpoint. If you follow this, if we go to the next slide, if we follow this convention, consider putting the target scope at the top of the file. This ordering makes sense when you're used to other infrastructure as code languages. So for example, the language in ARM templates, if you're coming from ARM templates, that this kind of convention would be very, very familiar to you. But it also makes your templates easy to understand because it's clear where to look for specific types of elements. So if I'm searching a large Bicep file and we're grouping elements by element type, I can go, okay, what parameters do I need to provide? That's at the top of the file. What variables are being used? Scroll a little bit down. Then the resources are defined. So it's kind of like a logical sequence of elements. Because in longer templates, it can be difficult to jump between the elements. So if we have this kind of structure, it makes it a little bit simpler for us.
Yeah, agreed.
You still have to decide how to order your elements within these categories. So
and I have some opinions on that as well.
Yeah. You could put parameters below variables. You could put resources, modules before resources. Yeah. Josh, what are your opinions on this?
Yeah, I mean, I generally do follow this particular structure, right? Grouping elements by element type. It is possible, though, if you are dealing with a pretty long file, whether it's a main.bicep file referencing a bunch of modules, that you could have, 10, 20, 30 lines of parameters before you get to the next section. And it might be a lot to kind of go through. So there are, I think as the size increases, I think this gets a little bit more difficult, but it's generally my preferred method. What I do here as well, though, and kind of when I build a file in my mind, I also, and I think I mentioned this before, kind of structure my parameters, variables, and resources within those individual element types, kind of mentally the sequence in which they would actually be deployed. I don't know how many times I've gone and looked at a sample, on somebody's blog about how to build, a Bicep file for a particular resource. And let's say it's an app service plan and a storage account and an app service. And it defines the app service right at the beginning, but then I got to scroll down like 60 lines of code to see where the app service plan gets identified. So to me, personal opinion, not a best practice. I don't think that we could clearly define that as a best practice, but that's a personal opinion that I like to sequence, my items in the order which I think they will be deployed. The one thing you mentioned here on target scope, we're actually going to have a conversation on this. We're going to actually have a whole module on deployments to different scopes within Azure, whether we're talking resource group, subscription management group, or tenant. That's going to be in the advanced section, a few weeks from now. So what about grouping elements by resource? Will, what do you think about this strategy?
It's an alternative. So essentially what we're doing here is we're grouping our elements based on the type of resources that we're being deployed. So we're deploying. So we've got our parameter names for environment type and resource name suffix. And then all of our storage account elements are being grouped together. So you see I've got a parameter for the SKU name that I'm going to use for the storage. I've got my variable for the account name, the actual resource itself, and then any outputs that we need to provide for that resource. And then below that, I've got my elements for my SQL database. So essentially, you can group all the parameters, variables, resources, and outputs that kind of relate to those resources. And this can make your template easier to read, because all the elements you need for a specific resource are grouped in one place. So depending on how we name our resources, we can, as we scroll down the template, we go, okay, this belongs to all our storage. All of these elements belong to a storage account. All of these elements belong to a SQL database. However, it does make it a little bit harder to check how specific elements types are declared. So if you want to review all of your parameters, you've got to jump around your template to go, okay, these are all the parameters I'm providing to my storage account. And then further down the file, I've got to, here are all my parameters for my SQL database. So the important thing to note here is that you need to consider how to handle, parameters and variables that are common to multiple resources, such as that environment type, particularly when you're using a configuration map. So common parameters and variables should be placed together and usually at the top of the file. Agreed.
And I think it's pretty safe to say that we're talking about Bicep files in terms of collaboration, right? So as long as the team has agreed to a method, right, where you don't have one person on the team, grouping by elements and then one group grouping by resource type, as long as there's kind of like a set defined structure, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, and it might make more sense to create modules for groups of related resources instead, and then use a simpler template to just combine all these modules. We'll talk about modules in more detail in other Bicep lessons, but if you're finding that you're grouping a lot of related elements together, particularly to a resource, it might be simpler to just pull that out and put it into a module that your main Bicep template can use.
Yeah, agreed. So we talked a little bit before in our example template about white space as well, blank lines, right, or spaces between these different element types, spaces between parameters, spaces between variables, especially if you're going to be adding some descriptors in there, which we'll talk about in a little bit here, like description or additional comments. But that extra white space, there's nothing wrong with having a blank line, right? It doesn't add to the complexity of the file. It just creates a little bit of space there to make it easier to read. So the next couple of slides, the next couple of conversations here, one thing that you're going to notice in the bottom right-hand corner, these topics have been covered before. So for example, here we're talking about doing loops on resources. If we've got multiple resources that we need to create, perhaps we can create a kind of an object array, and we can loop through a series of resources to simplify our code. This is going to be a huge benefit in simplifying our overall templates. We had an entire module on loops and conditions. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you see the actual link to that episode and also the QR code. So if you simply scan that, it'll take you back to episode 4, and you can get caught up on loops and conditions. So, again, looking for places where we define multiple resources that are identical, right? If you think about a virtual machine, maybe you need to deploy 10 virtual machines. Well, I can go in and I can define 10 resources or virtual machines, or I can just simply create a loop and loop through that configuration of the virtual machine. So that might simplify our templates as well. We can also do conditional deployments, as you see here in an example. Maybe we don't want to deploy certain resources to a dev environment or certain resources to a production environment. Maybe we don't need to deploy the VPN gateway with the connectivity back to on-premises in our dev test structures. So we can use if statements and if conditions to make a decision as to whether or not certain resources are deployed. And that was actually covered also in episode 4. Again, the QR code there will take you to that. In regards to dependencies, we had a conversation around dependencies. Here's the exact example from the original file that we took a look at. We've mentioned over the course of the last 7 weeks that dependencies are auto-calculated within Bicep. So in our example earlier, we didn't need lines 86, 87, and 88 because the way that we were defining the name of the resource is that we were tying it into that parent resource in this particular case. So this firewall rule is part of the SQL Server. We don't have to explicitly define that depends on statement. Anything to add there, Will?
No, I think you pretty much covered it.
All right. So parent-child relationships, how are we expressing those appropriately within our files? Again, this was covered in episode 6, so just 2 weeks ago. Again, QR code for you to revisit that particular session. But in Azure Resource Manager and Bicep, there is this concept of child resources, and we saw that in the example. Like a container is a child resource of a blob service. A subnet is a child resource of a VNet, and we can usually define these by using the parent property inside a resource. And again, that helps to auto calculate that dependency. Right. So in terms of resource properties, this is something that we very frequently see in outputs or referencing a resource that exists in another module or even within the same actual Bicep file. We saw this example before of tying an app service into an app service plan that we can use the symbolic name to reference certain resource properties of resources that either already exist or resources that were defined in that particular file and based on deployment would exist in advance. We can access all of the different properties or most of the different properties. Obviously, it depends on the type of resource being declared. But this one shows an example of accessing the ID of a log analytics workspace. We can access default host names of app services and extract all different kinds of information using the symbolic name. All right. So version control, how do we use version control effectively? We also had another episode 7, on utilizing Git in terms of your collaboration with Bicep. But with version control, we can use this, to track our changes to our files. So, here it uses the example of returning to an older version of our code if we do make a mistake. Right. So the one phrase there, commit your work often to your repo as often as you possibly can. I am not a good steward of that. Sometimes I will go way too long without doing commits. And there are people on my team that will attest to that. But any comments here on Git?
Yeah, using Git for infrastructure code is really, it's a really simple way of keeping or tracking the versions of your code and really effective too. So rather than trying to, if someone manually changes something in the Azure portal, it takes forever when something goes down to diagnose that, and we might not even find that problem. But if we're using Git or using version control, it's great. We can actually do just some differences between different commits, and we can diagnose problems really quickly. And it just helps accelerate that process of deploying our infrastructure.
Awesome.
Huge fan of using Git for infrastructure as code.
All right, so let's talk about every developer and IT person's favorite task, and that is documentation. We all love documentation. So
absolutely love it.
Let's talk about documenting our code, adding comments. So Will, let's start this conversation.
Cool. So the first thing to mention right away is that good Bicep code is self-documenting. And what this means is it uses a clear naming and good structure. So when our colleagues and teammates read our Bicep code, they can understand quickly of what's going on. So if they need to make changes themselves, it gives them the confidence that what they're changing are the right changes. If we think back to our Bicep template earlier, that container one might have been a super important container, but we don't know that because it's just called container one. So we're making changes to it, and it might be critical to the foundation of our business. But we haven't written our code in a way that's self-documenting to say, to kind of tell that. However, in some situations, we might need to clarify certain code by adding extra documentation to our Bicep files. So also, after your template is deployed and resources have been created in Azure, it's important that anyone that looks after your Azure environment to understand what resource is and what it's used for. So let's start off by looking at some comments, adding comments to our code. So Bicep actually, as we saw earlier in our previous template, it actually enables you to add comments to your code. And essentially, comments are human readable text that documents your code, but when we deploy our file to Azure, it's ignored. And Bicep supports two types of comments. So we can have single line comments, which start with a double slash or / character sequence, and they continue to the end of the line. Or we can have multi-line comments. So we can have a / and a star and a star / character sequences to surround the comments. And this can span multiple lines, as we can see from lines 36 to 39. A good tip, if we go to the next slide, avoid using comments for really obvious and clearer parts of your code. Commenting can be good, it can be effective when used right, but having too many comments actually reduces the readability of your code. Particularly, just a personal kind of anecdote, if you're using dark mode and it's the middle of the night and all of a sudden you've got these massive blocks of comments and it's all in that, nice bright green that we all like and, wish we could paint our houses using that color. It can reduce the readability of your code. And it's also easy to forget to update your comments when the code changes in the future. Our code is always evolving, or always should be evolving. It's easy to forget comments as those code changes, as we change our code moving forward. So the main focus here is to document the unique logic and complex expressions.
Yeah, and thinking back to that first file that we took a look at, the role definition section, right? That would be an area where I could see, a long comment, a very descriptive comment, because again, the logic behind that is a little difficult to understand. So there's definitely a place for extensive comments, but as you mentioned at the beginning of the section, good code is self-documenting. So we shouldn't need too many comments or redundant comments if our naming conventions and things are clear. Right?
Yeah. Now we can also add comments to our parameter files, which is pretty cool. So essentially parameter files enable us to create a JSON file that specify a set of parameter values for our deployments. And the values that you specify in a parameter file, this can also benefit from being documented as well. It's generally good practice to add comments to parameter files when you're working with parameter values that might not be immediately clear to someone reading the file. So if we go back to our QA team, SKU values might be very, because if you're working in Azure day-to-day, the actual values of the SKU, or the names of the SKU, might be very clear to you and understandable, and you might understand what those mean. Other team members might not, so that might benefit from a comment. Another example might be that if your Bicep template might include a parameter for the URL to access your company's product stock API, so that your website can actually display whether your toys are in stock for your warehouse or not. The URLs might not be that easy to understand right away. So that's also another good candidate for a comment.
Do you think it's a good practice to do comments within the Bicep file and the JSON file as well? In both spots?
It depends. I mean, it depends on the parameter value, right? And the parameter or what you're commenting. So the idea is, yes, it should be self-documenting, but if something is super complex, even if you've used proper naming conventions, it might not be implied knowledge, so knowledge that might be implied to you and I, might not necessarily be implied knowledge to somebody else. So we need to be considerate to our team members and say, hey, this is fairly straightforward for us as developers, but if you're on the QA team, they might not encounter these this terminology day to day. So that parameter file or this piece of Bicep code, that might be a good candidate to comment this and just explain it a little bit more.
All right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about adding descriptions to parameters, variables, and outputs. So we do have the ability, as you see here in this little example, is to add a little bit of a description to the parameter names. And it can be done on variables, and it can be done on outputs as well. This is within the Bicep tooling. I believe it's just the parameters that actually carry over to the JSON file, the description that carries over to the JSON file when you actually do a conversion from Bicep to JSON prior to deployment. But the tooling within VS Code does give you the ability to add description decorators to any type of resource or element that you're actually defining. We do have the ability as well to add descriptions within the resource definition itself. So you can see that here kind of on line 41, the description of this is, contributor access on the storage account. So it's defining that role definition that we talked about before. So this decorator, again, it gives us the ability to kind of add some information, some metadata, if you will, about these different element types. So what about resource tags? We've talked about resource tags in other discussions, but how does this help us with our collaboration here, Will?
Well, there are situations where we'll need to track information about our Azure deployed Azure resources, and this could include stuff like allocating your Azure cost to specific cost centers. So if you work in a large organization, then there are different cost centers for different departments. This could be, we can use resource tags to kind of say, hey, this resource belongs to our marketing department or our manufacturing department, and it's a good way to actually allocate those costs to specific cost centers. Understanding how the data that's contained in our databases and storage accounts, particularly if you're working with complex privacy or highly regulated scenarios, this can be, using resource tags can actually be really beneficial to kind of tell people how the data should be classified and be protected. Recording the name of the team or person who's responsible for the management of the resource. So if you're working in a large organization, you might be working with resources that you're not necessarily controlling within your infrastructure as code, and you might not be responsible for. So having those resource tags can actually be really beneficial to say, hey, this resource belongs to the payments development team, for example, and you can actually reach out to them saying, hey, there seems to be a problem. Can you help us out? And also tracking the name of the environment that the resource relates to. So is this a development resource? Is this a production resource? That's really critical to know using resource tags. Yeah, you don't want to be messing around with resources in production by accident. That's not what we want to do. So resource tags essentially enable us to store important metadata about our resources. And we can actually define our resource tags in our Bicep code, and Azure will store that information within the resource when we deploy it. And it's great because we can actually query those resource tags using tools such as PowerShell or the Azure CLI. And as we've got up on the screen here, we can actually see the tags on the Azure. When we navigate to our resources, we can actually see our tags within our resource in the portal, which is really quite cool.
Awesome. All right, so we've talked about all these features. We've talked about all these pieces. So let's actually get in and refactor, kind of clean up that original Bicep file. So Will, you're going to pull up VS Code, and we're going to kind of go through this step by step and kind of clean up this file.
Yes, let's go ahead and do that. How much time do I actually have?
We got a little over 20 minutes, so I think we've got some time.
Cool. So, all right, let's navigate right up to the top. And let's start with these parameters. So we've got our parameter for a SKU name here, right? And if I just do a Control F on that, that's being used in my hosting plan. So I'm thinking we should make that a little bit more explicit, right?
I agree.
Cool. So what we can do in VS Code, let's hope this works. So if I press F2, I can actually rename this, and it will rename it throughout my whole Bicep file. So if I go app service plan SKU name, what do you think of that? Is that good?
You got an extra P in app at the beginning, but other than
Yes,
that,
I do. Thank you. That's why pair programming is so powerful.
Yes.
We don't want to make those mistakes, right?
Yeah, looks
so
great.
If I press enter there, and if I just do that again, we can see it's been changed there as well.
Yeah. So we don't have to go manually make that adjustment each place where we change that parameter. That's fantastic.
Yeah, because if it's a massive file, that's painful. You don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So this is just, I'm going to do this as well for the app service SKU plan as well, capacity, sorry, as well. So app service plan SKU capacity. Press enter. Just do a Control F on that. There we go.
Looks good.
Beautiful.
Looks good.
Awesome. Cool. So what I might do as well, so I've got my allow parameter here and min value. I'm going to put some white space between that parameter as well.
Agreed.
What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. As we kind of talked about before, it kind of made those two parameters seem like they belonged together, that they were for the same resource. But one obviously is for an app service plan and the other was related to SQL. So that white space is a huge help there.
Should we add some descriptions to some of these parameters as well?
Descriptions on every parameter.
all the parameters.
All the parameters,
so
yeah.
The location one, I'm just going to put the location. Resources 2. Now, what I like to do, so the default value is the location of the resource group. So if I'm defining a default value in my parameter, I'd just like to add a little bit more of a description saying, hey, the default value will be the location of our resource group. Cool.
Looks great.
Just in interest of time, we can also add a description for, so the name of the SKU for our app service plan. One thing I think a description would be very beneficial for would be this managed identity name. But before we do that, is there anything else that we want to kind of change here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, considering time, probably not want to put in all of the descriptions, but I think min value there for app service plan SKU capacity, we may want to do a max value, right? Save ourselves a little bit of money. So if somebody doesn't put too many in there. So we might want to do a max value, maybe put 5 in there for the max value.
Yeah, let's put
5 or 10. Yeah.
Awesome.
You had talked about before, maybe making the SQL administrator login, the username, maybe making that a secure parameter as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Looks good.
That as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to, because it's bugging me, just put a little bit of white space between that. So we've got our managed identity name and our role definition ID. So a couple of questions about this. Let's look at this managed identity name parameter first. It doesn't have a default value. Can we fix that or create the name? Can we create the name automatically within the template? What do you think?
Yeah. So the process that I usually follow here, I would actually, most of my names I tend to define in variables as opposed in parameters, because when I'm doing naming conventions, when I'm thinking about, naming conventions, I have a certain type of resource. So I've got an identifier for the type. I've got, is it prod or is it dev? I've got the region that it's in. And so what I usually do is I'll define some things like that in parameters, but then I will concatenate the name or the string interpolation down at the variable level. But in this case, we may want to create a default value for the managed identity name, right? It's not something that, I don't believe it has to be globally unique. So we may want to put in a default value there. Without a value, it is obviously what it is it's expecting a value to be injected from the parameters file. Or for some other resource, whether it's through AZCLI or whatever it is, it's expecting a value to be submitted. So maybe we do want to put a default value in there.
Okay, so what I'm thinking for managed identity, if I use GUID and if I go role definition ID, resource group dot ID, And that will just be a GUID for the role name based on the role definition ID and the scope of the resource and the scopes of the resource group ID. And this will return a GUID or the same GUID every time the template is deployed to the same resource group. What do you think of that?
I think that's fantastic.
Cool. Now let's look at that role definition ID. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Azure has kind of like a rich RBAC capability. So there are lots of different roles. So that role definition ID kind of bugs me because it's like, well, what role is that actually granting? What do you think?
So yeah, I mean, I think we either need to have a description in here or a comment. We need to identify, where that ID is coming from, what the value of that ID is, right? So you default roles, built-in roles, they're going to have that ID. That ID is not going to change. We're not talking about a custom role. We're talking about a predefined built-in role. So a description or a comment, just for clarity here as to what that defines.
Cool. So what I'm going to put is the what can I put for a description? I could say the role definition
ID, role definition ID for some service. Yeah.
For managed identity. And because I've got it on another screen, I'm going to say default value is contributor role. What I can actually do, looking at that now, if I can actually do a little renaming strategy and go contributor role definition ID, just to make it a little bit more explicit throughout my template.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay, so now let's go a little bit further down to these parameters here. So we've got parameter for the website name, container one name, which I think we should change, and product manuals name. So say if we speak to our colleagues and we can actually have a chat about what specific SKUs that we're going to use depending on the environment that we're going to deploy to. So what we can do is use our configuration set. So if I just do a little bit of copy and pasting here, one moment, just copy and paste that. I'm just going to put that underneath here just for now. That's obviously a lot, but here I've got my environment configuration map. I've got my production values here. So for my app service plan, I've got SKU, the name of the SKU and the capacity. For my storage account, I've got the SKU name. And for my SQL database, the name and the tier. And then if I just close that, so those are my production values. And I've got my test configuration values as well. So they're all different here. So I'm using a free app service plan here, using the storage account, standard local redundancy, and a basic SQL database SKU. So I've got that there. This container name isn't getting to me. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go product specs container. It's a blob container as well, so I might just put blob container there as well. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Getting rid of container one name is what we need to do here.
Cool. And then we'll use some camel casing for this as well. So again, F2. Name's fine. It's just the camel case there as well. Cool. Okay.
So what do you think about how we're defining two containers as parameters, but we're defining our storage account as a variable?
We could simplify that. So the storage account, if we're deploying a storage account to multiple different environments, we're going to have to change it each time, right?
Yeah.
So instead of what I'm going to do, just put that up here. Actually define it before our containers, put a bit of white space there, and I'm just going to put parameter make that a type string. Cool. Okay. Anything else?
No, I mean, we can make some adjustments as well, like with, hosting plan name and SQL Server name as well. But, it depends on how you want to define your names, where you want to define your names. Are you trying to keep that sequence that we kind of talked about before? But yeah, no, this looks great. This looks great.
Cool. So let's dive into some of our resources. So right from the bat, let's get rid of this squiggly line, and we'll just use location. Now, if we want to specifically deploy it to the East US and our our resource group isn't in the East US, we can actually create another variable for that, or even a parameter, and just use a default value for that storage account. This child resource here, what do you think of that?
Which one are you looking at? The blob services one?
Yeah, 97 to 99.
Yeah. Are you, this is kind of something that you can look at it from different ways. You can either define it, within, as a child within the storage account definition, or you can extract that and make that apparent. I think for clarity, it's much easier to kind of pull it out and define it the way that we did kind of container one, but in this case for the storage account itself.
Because we've got we haven't defined, here's our other container. So what I like, what we can do here is we can actually use a for loop for these different containers within a storage account. Perfect. So just do some quick copy and pasting of what I made earlier, just to be focused on time. So what I can do is copy that there, and then add my blob container names. So what I need to do is just introduce my blob container names as variables. And what we can do, if I remove that, just add those there. So those are my blob container names that we're deploying to the same storage account. So essentially, if we have identical resources or multiple resources that we're deploying that are generalized, we can actually, here I've got an array of strings defining the blob container names, and then I'm using that for loop here. So for each blob container name in that array, I want to create a container within my storage account. So what I can do is I can actually get rid of this resource entirely.
That cleans it up really well. Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing better than deleting redundant code.
Yes.
It's so therapeutic. Oh, that's beautiful. Anyway,
looks good. Looks good. Yeah, because those containers, there's really no difference there, right? Like you're just defining the name of the container. You're not making any adjustments there, so you might as well just do a loop for that. Yeah.
Cool. Let's have a look at some of the symbolic names. So here on line 88, I'm using the symbolic name of storage account, and I'm using camel case capitalization. But if I come down here, the SQL Server isn't. So what I can do, I will press F2 on that actually, and just go to SQL Server just to make sure that's consistent throughout.
Perfect.
Cool. Just make sure that there's nothing else there. There's also these resources as well, which use kind of snake case capitalization.
Yeah.
What we can do, just to keep this consistent, I'll remove that and just use camel case for everything. Make sure my hosting plan's okay, website's okay.
We can get rid of that block. Don't need
let's get rid of
big section there. Yep.
That's going to very therapeutic. Role assignment as well. Role assignment. Make sure my spelling's on form. And yeah, let's remove you as well. Cool. Looks good.
Looking good. Yeah. I think we got a depends on line in the SQL that we can pull out as well. Yep. Right there. We can get rid of our depends on because we know that that's auto calculated. So things are looking really good. I know we could move the managed identity up a little bit higher. We were defining that really low in the template or further down in the template. So we may want to consider moving that up a little bit earlier since it gets referenced by the app service before it. But that's just a personal preference. That's not a,
Okay.
And then I think the other thing we want to do is we probably want to reference that configuration map.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
So here we've got, there's the app service. So we've got the app service plan SKU name and the SKU capacity. So if let's go to the SQL database first. So here, we're just essentially naming it as basic, but what we can do is go environment configuration map, open up the bracket, and then environment type. Environment type. That's going to give me what I want. Right. SQL. Just check my configuration map. So, any ideas, Josh?
Let's see. I lost where you're at. So SQL database name.
I know what's going on.
Yeah.
So essentially, I need to add another parameter for environment type.
Yes.
So let's do that. Let's be consistent about this. We'll just do it here. There might be jumping about between the templates, but I want to be consistent by element type. So essentially what's going to happen here is this environment type will, the allowed values for this parameter are production or test. So when we define which environment that we're using, we come down to our configuration map. We've got production, which will reference these values, and then test, which will reference these values. So when I'm actually using it down here, you see that red line's gone away now.
Went away. So that's how we're referencing the configuration map. That's awesome.
SQL database dot SKU, and that will reference, depending on which environment we deploy to, that configuration value.
All right. So you know what, we're getting close to the end of time. But I think we covered all of the main pieces there. Nice to see the configuration map and how we actually reference that. So let's transition back over to the presentation real quick. Will, thank you so much for the demo. That was absolutely awesome. So what did we talk about today, Will?
So, sorry, let me just come back to it.
No worries.
Do we want to do a knowledge check, or are we just going straight into?
I think we're going to go straight to the summary. We've only got a couple minutes left. So for everybody, we did skip over the knowledge check, but that is available on the Learn module. So go take some time, go through the Learn module, go through the knowledge check, and see how you did. So from a summary for today, Will, what we go through today?
So we learned how to just essentially make our Bicep templates more flexible for other people to use. And this includes selecting the appropriate parameters for our Bicep file, structuring our Bicep code and parameters to actually support that team collaboration. And we also learned how to document our Bicep code to make it self-documenting, and also by using comments and resource tags so we can help our teammates to say, this is what our Bicep code does and what it's used for.
Awesome. So if again, we showed this at the beginning of today's session, but if you do want to follow along with this, here's the link to the actual Learn module. You can use the QR code or the link there. We do have, again, this is actually, I'm sorry, this is the actual link to the file, to the Learn module and the QR code there. And then next week, we've got another session coming up next week. Will, what is happening next?
I'm actually really looking forward to this one, because this is a really cool and powerful technique that we can use when deploying our Bicep templates. We can actually preview our Azure deployments by using the what if, so we can see what's actually going to be deployed before we actually deploy it. So that's going to be a super powerful lesson next week.
Absolutely. So seriously, everybody, thank you very much for attending today. Thanks for sitting with us for the last hour and a half. Thank you, William Salazar, for the moderator. I know the questions were a little quiet, at least coming to us today, but hopefully y'all had some really great questions for William. So once again, thanks everybody. Will, thank you very much. It was great chatting with you today.
Awesome. Likewise. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.